Hello, welcome to Musicians Roundtable. I'm Jeffrey Goodman here in Los Angeles, and our guest today is Peter Croton, who's in Basel, Switzerland. So welcome, Peter. How are you doing there today?
Thank you. I'm doing very well. It was a lovely spring day in Basel, Switzerland, and had a good time playing some lute, playing some terz guitar, actually.
Hmm.
And I'm very happy to be talking to you today. For me, it's the evening. We're 9 hours later here.
Yes. So the subject matter of our uh, discussion and interview today is your book, Performing Baroque Music on the Classical Guitar. And I um, I've had this book for a few years and have found it to be an immensely uh, wonderful resource that I can go back to again and again. I'd like to ask you first, though, if you could give a sense of your musical background, where you started, where the lutes and other things came in over time.
Okay, well, thank you for that question. I started playing folk guitar when I was 5 years old. I saw some people playing guitar and singing in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where we were living at the time. I was completely enthralled with that, and I decided that's what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to play guitar and sing if possible. So I started having folk guitar lessons when I was 5, and I was totally devoted to it. And by the time I turned 6, I was already performing. I did my first performance in a pizza hall in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and then I basically was playing folk guitar and singing folk songs through my childhood, performing quite often actually. And then when I was about 12, my voice changed, and I did not like the way my voice sounded anymore. So I decided I was going to focus on instrumental playing, and continued playing folk guitar, but then I focused more on jazz guitar. And through my teen years, I played a lot of jazz guitar. Also, when I entered Oberlin Conservatory of Music, I had jazz guitar. I played jazz guitar in ensembles there. But also around my mid-teens, I started playing classical guitar. So when I was at the Oberlin Conservatory of Music, I had classical guitar lessons, jazz ensemble, and I was introduced to the lute when I was about 19. And I completely fell in love with the sound and the repertoire of the lute. And this was at the time the Renaissance lute. And so I gradually switched over from jazz guitar and classical guitar to Renaissance lute. I became a lute major at Oberlin. They had to create a major for me. Um, and then after I graduated from Oberlin, I came to Basel to study at the Schola Cantorum Baseliensis, which is a school dedicated to the study and research of early music. And one thing that was fascinating to me, because basically I have more of a jazz background than a classical background, is how close so many elements of jazz playing and jazz phrasing are to Baroque playing and Baroque phrasing.
So one of the things that I was very interested in is how did this book evolve in your experience teaching and musical life?
Yes, that's a great question, and it certainly evolved slowly, as one might suspect. The origin of it is that when I was 27 years old, I got a lute teaching position at a conservatory of music in Switzerland. And one of the things they tasked me with was teaching Baroque chamber music to modern musicians, and also historical performance practice to modern musicians, including the classical guitarists at that conservatory. So I had an inkling of some things about historical performance practice, but certainly at the age of 27, I hadn't done a lot of research or a lot of reading on my own. So that set me on a path of reading historical sources, reading secondary material, and trying to come to terms with how to express the ideas of expression in Baroque music to modern musicians, and in particular classical guitarists. So I did that for many years, and also at some point I started doing similar work at the Basel Conservatory of Music. And so for a number of years I was teaching this, and at some point it just occurred to me, well, I've done all this research and all this reading, and I've spent so much time explaining these expressive aspects or stylistic aspects to classical guitarists, that maybe it would be good to write this down and provide source material for guitarists so that they don't have to spend 30 years reading through all the sources, but that they can read my book and see a summary of what I feel are the most important sources and ideas and concepts for their performance of Baroque music.
Now that is something that I've benefited by greatly, and also I like that in your bibliography you have anyone who wants to further delve into the source materials can go directly and explore them themselves, and that in and of itself is something of great value. I was going to say to you, when you hear today's and late 20th century classical guitarists playing Baroque music, what do you see in their approach in major terms that could benefit by more knowledge of the performance practices?
Well,
That's a big question.
that's a huge question. It's also there has to be a differentiated answer, because I've heard, of course, guitarists in various parts of the world, and there's not one way of playing Baroque music on the classical guitar these days. For example, in Basel, where I teach lute and historical performance practice, the guitar program is run by a fellow who's very knowledgeable about practices in the Renaissance and Baroque. His name is Pablo Marquez. And so when I hear his students play, there's quite a lot of understanding behind their playing. I've been in other places where the guitarists play with what if I may diplomatically say, less understanding of the music. And to get to your question about the kind of playing of Baroque music by guitarists that developed in the late 20th century, and in many cases continues until now, I would say that the most important aspect that I would want them to transform is that there is an idea of perfection that has crept into their playing. I was also trained this way when I had classical guitar lessons in the 70s. I was aiming at some sort of perfection, and perfection in this context means that whether you play a note with the index, the middle, or the ring finger, it sounds the same. When you play a phrase, you might do a crescendo or a decrescendo, but the goal was a tremendous evenness and regularity in the tone color and in the rhythmic approach. And for me, one of the most important things about playing in an expressive, or as I like to call it, a rhetorical manner, is that there's a lot of irregularity in that, a lot of unevenness, a lot of variety in tone color, a lot of variety in dynamic, and a lot of variety in rhythm. And so that would be one of the first things that I would comment on, is try to come a bit away from the concept that it has to be a perfect, even performance, and allow the rough edges to come out and allow the unevenness to come out, and see how that reflects then the music and the communication of the music, just as a basic first answer.
This suggests something that I've also dealt with in my musical life a great deal. And I would say that if I go back to the 70s and 80s and thereafter, the idea of, I would say in general, there was a kind of a stereotypical misconception of historical performance practice. And that is that if you played it in that, observing those types of parameters, that it would be sterile, academic, dry, boring. And actually, when and your book exemplifies this, that when you study it, you realize that there are massive points of liberation that can be experienced by the musician and still be informed by the background idea of perfection that you mentioned, to do things as immaculately as possible,
Hmm.
but freely. And I'm remembering suddenly that many years ago, I think it was in the early 80s, that Julian Bream came and gave a master class at the San Francisco Conservatory. And I drove up there and I happily audited it. And he began by saying something like this, that for a classical musician, the ideas of love and perfection are the two bookends that everyone strives for: the love, the passion, the expression, but the perfection itself, the technical thing. And to be too much engaged in the perfectionistic mode is self defeating, as is a completely unhinged,
Hmm.
uninformed uh, um, approach to playing it in any old personal way. So, so he really almost way back then was probably thinking along the lines of some of the things that you're saying now.
So to pick up on something you said, you used a wonderful word, liberation. And I think liberation is a great word to use. And of course, it's a question of what we're liberating ourselves from. But I think to play Baroque music in a stylistically expressive way, we need to liberate ourselves from the notation, because the notation gives us an idea of what notes the composer wanted us to play, but it does not give us a sense of the rhetorical expressiveness that we can play the music with. So this liberation from the feeling that we have to play the music exactly as notated is an extremely important concept that you now actually pointed to.
Well, so that comes to really one of the major um, uh, aspects of your book is the idea of rhetoric. And that was something that actually I can say that I'd never run across before as a term. The underlying things that you discuss, of course, yes. But could you discuss what the idea of rhetoric meant to the Baroque world and then as you look at it today?
Yes, that's another huge question. We could talk about that for a few weeks. Um, so I have to back up a little bit to Renaissance polyphony. Um, so the most pure art form in music in the 15th and for a lot of the 16th century was polyphony. You have multiple voices, and the composers like Josquin des Prez or later Palestrina were trying to make a very homogeneous sound, but with independent voices. So you'd have the soprano going in one direction, the alto, the tenor, the bass going in another direction, and it has to all fit together and work together. So this was a music that was mostly very oriented towards the beauty of the actual music. And the idea of text expression was a bit foreign to them. Around the mid 16th century, they started trying more to integrate text expression into this kind of polyphonic music. But it was difficult because of the independence of voices, and you would have the same text having four different musics that have to fit together. And so in the late 16th century, there were a group of people in Italy, and they called themselves the Camerata, the Camerata in Florence, and they were interested in all aspects of art and music and philosophy, trying to recover what they felt was the great art from ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And they recognized that then this word rhetoric kept popping up, and they were studying rhetoric as best as they could. And then they recognized that in Greek music, way back, centuries before, um, and millenniums before, that the idea of expressing a text through music in well, I'll say the rhetorical way, was the highest art that could be done in music. And these people like Signor Bardi, Giulio Caccini, Vincenzo Galilei, then decided that they wanted to recreate Greek music, but do it in their own way, so that one could use music to express the text in a more profound and rhetorical manner. And so basically they recognized that to express a text in a rhetorical manner, you have to pay attention to the length of the important words, the length of the less important words, the length of the important syllables, the lesser length of the less important syllables. So you need to write music that represents that. And then they felt it was not possible to do that in a polyphonic context. So they invented this new kind of music that was then called monody, or recitative style, where the point of the music was to strengthen the expression of the text. And then the idea of rhetoric is simply, in this context, that the rhetorical speech to them, and also ancient Greece and Rome, was to speak in a manner that convinces people of something, or transmits feelings, or better said, actually, or stimulates the feelings in the listener. That's actually the better way of putting it. And so they focused on writing this music where if somebody sang a particular text, whether it was melancholy or happy, or something with longing, or a love song, that the listeners would feel that very profoundly. And they developed a whole lot of techniques for writing this kind of music, all based on the idea that rhetorical speech can lead to rhetorical singing and can stimulate a vast array of feelings in the listener. And of course, just to add one more sentence to that, very soon in the early 17th century, the instrumentalists began to write music that also represented this, but without words. So they were influenced by the Monteverdis, the Guccinis, and then you have people like Alessandro Piccinini, Kapsberger, Frescobaldi, who were then writing rhetorical instrumental music, but always pointing to the fact for them that the instrumentalists, when they play, must imitate the way the singers sing.
So that is a profoundly stimulating idea. And recently, I've been playing a lot of French Baroque music on my classical guitar, and that liberation and that sense of seeking out the expression is something that really energizes how I'm looking at it. So it's been very, very helpful for me personally. Can you briefly, I've always wondered about this. If you think about, say, in a Baroque time frame, French music, Italian music, German music, and the styles that were that we think that we have a sense of how they went about it. Do you think that a German musician would have a sense of the French style? Was that just dependent on their education or their travels? How did the people of that time know about anything other than their local community that they would tend to live in, and how they did their music?
Yes, I heard you say a brief answer, so I will try to keep it to that. So obviously, those were the days before the internet, before CDs. People traveled. So if we even go back to, let's say, John Dowland traveled. He traveled from his native England to Denmark. He traveled to Germany. He traveled to Italy. He traveled to France. So in his travels, he transmitted his music. He also was influenced by the music he heard. And we can extend that into the Baroque period, where you simply have people traveling. Like, for example, in the mid 17th century, a fellow by the name of Wolfgang Mölius, a German guy, he traveled down to Italy, listened to the Italian singers, came back to Germany, and wrote a treatise on how the Italian singers sing. You have Georges Muffat traveling around Europe, being influenced by the French style, being influenced by the Italian style. So there was a lot of traveling involved. And we have to remember that even though we use the term Germany now, for example, or Italy, these weren't established countries at that point. So you'll have somebody traveling from, let's say, southern Germany to northern Germany, hearing a different kind of music, or from northern Italy to southern Italy. So there was a certain amount of traveling and a certain amount of then absorption of the style and passing on of the style. So that by the time, let's say, we get to the first half of the 18th century in Germany, we have a lot of influence in Germany coming from the French style, which they saw naturally through the publications, a lot of influence of the Italian style, which they also saw through publications, but also through travels. But stylistically, the French and the Italian Baroque music are very, very different. We have a huge task now, hundreds of years later. And then to get back to Germany for a moment. So the Germans felt that well, I can't speak for all Germans, but in the writings, often we see that they felt that they took the best of the French style and the best of the Italian style, and they fused that into the German style, which is, of course, the best music. So there was a lot of influence and cross influence through the travels and through the manuscripts and through the publications.
That's absolutely fascinating. I hope that someday Netflix will make uh, a, a bio series about John Dowland, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And if you add to that some of the espionage that they were asked to conduct in the various courts that they played in, that would add another flavor for people to consider.
Yes.
I wanted to just move to the the ideas of improvisation and how, given for example, if you have a score, a tablature from Robert de Bizet, and you have a prelude, um, how might improvisation be used for playing some of those pieces?
Yes. So it really depends on what period you're talking about and what country. Um, so if we start with French music, so let's say French music from the second half of the 17th century. Let's just start there. You have the typical thing of the performer improvising the entire prelude. It's an interesting, if we look at one of the great Baroque lute composers of the 17th century, was named Ennemond Gautier. He was an older guy, so they called him Vieux Gautier, which means the old Gautier. And we have a pretty huge collection of pieces that were published by him or that appear in manuscripts, but there are no preludes, zero, that I know of. There are Allemande, Courante, Gigue, Canary, but there are no preludes. Why? Probably because he simply improvised them and didn't bother to write them down. So we start with that if a Baroque lutenist in France was going to do a series of dances that they had pre-composed, they most likely would have, in that key, improvised a prelude. And this is something that we can learn today. I teach this, I work with this with my students. And it's possible because it's basically you create a harmonic structure and then you arpeggiate or you make little connections. I could demonstrate if that would work out. We take a little pause and I hook up the microphone, I could play a bit. But that's the prelude. Now we get to, let's say, the Allemande or the sarabande. We have a number of written out variations in French Baroque music. They're called a double. It looks like the word double, but since it's French, they pronounce it double. And so what it is it's a variation on the sections of the piece. So you'll have the A section of the, let's say, the Allemande, and then the double, which is usually some sort of running eighth notes. And then you'll have the B section of the Allemande, and then the double, which is also some sort of running eighth notes. So they were not always, but sometimes giving us these examples of these, let's call it improvised variations on the A and the B section, but certainly with the expectation that the performer would do that themselves, because the majority of the pieces don't have doubles. There's a famous double by Johann Sebastian Bach, the saraband in B minor that we have from a violin sonata has, or a suite, has a written out double. And there's some other things, like also in the 997 from Bach, the presto, or whatever it's called exactly, the quick movement at the end has a double also. So then the improvisation could kick in if we play an Allemande by Denis Gautier or Charles Mouton, and then we improvise a double, which is actually not that difficult, because all you do is you follow the harmonic pattern that's there, and you play running eighth notes, and you've got a double. But you have to also understand the harmonic pattern. But it's not a crazy complex thing. It's something that can be learned. So that's, of course, one answer with regards to French music. If we talk briefly about Italian music, then they had something called a toccata. And that also, in many cases, would be improvised. So if you're going to do a series of little dances, in that key, you might just play a chord and then a run, and then a chord, and then a run to the next chord. And so improvisation was used in that way. And if I may make a last short comment about that, we know from many sources that the slow movements in Italy and also in France were not played the way they were written. Because often, if we take Arcangelo Corelli as an example, an adagio might be written in half notes. But he gives us examples of how he would play those notes. So you have a half note, and then another half note, and you play eighths or 16th or 32nd notes connecting those half notes. That was the stylistic way of playing. And it's only occasionally written out. It's mostly improvised. So we have examples from Corelli and Tartini and Gemignani. But if we study their works, we can learn to improvise on an adagio by, again, connecting those longer notes with runs. And there's also tutors that show us how to do it.
So this is a great example of what you mentioned at the beginning of our discussion of the connection between jazz today and the Baroque period. One other subject that I find really interesting is the concept that you address in your book of the notes inigal. And could you discuss that, how that in just general might apply to people who are playing Baroque music on the guitar?
Yes. So I think that goes back to what we spoke about earlier, to liberate ourselves from the notation. And I think it's very important to recognize that people in all these countries, England, France, Italy, Germany, and beyond, they played with a kind of rhythmic irregularity that is somewhat similar to jazz today. The way you go if you do that with straight eighth notes, it doesn't sound like jazz. It sounds sort of absurd. Excuse me for singing on this interview. And so there was, based on the sources I've read, there was a general irregular attitudes towards the melodic notes. So that would be in many cases, like in France, the eighth notes. In Italy, often it was the 16th notes. It's not the fastest notes. It's not the slower notes. It's sort of the in-between notes. The melodic notes were played with irregularity. And the notation was not possible to notate the way they played. And for that I have, because I don't want to misquote the great Francois Couperin, I would like to read a quote by Francois Couperin, 1717. Just as there is a large distance between grammar and declamation, there is an infinite distance between notated music and the manner of playing it well. So he's basically saying right there, don't play it as written, because that's just like speaking in a grammatical fashion, but not in a declamatory fashion. You have to play the music the way it feels, in effect. The note that he'll tell you which notes to play, but he won't tell you really how to feel it and how to play it rhythmically. And so I think that there's been a mistake for the last 70, 80 years in just terms of our concept of it. There's an excellent book, and I don't want to criticize the book because it's a fantastic book, and it's called Rhythmic Alteration in the 17th and 18th century. And even though the content of the book is fantastic, I think the title is wrong, because it suggests that if we play the music and we want to play it stylistically, we have to alter the music. It's not altering the music. It's recognizing that it was impossible to notate the music the way it was played. So in effect, we're recreating this flexible rhythmic approach that was impossible to notate. And then, of course, in France, they wrote about it a lot in 17th century France. They call it inégalité, not inigal. And they talk about how there's a wide variety going from, let's say, if we have it running eighth notes, 3 to 2, 5 to 3, 7 to 5. So it could be a dotted thing like D, ta da, ta da, ta da, ta da for a march, or maybe for a saraband, D, da, da, dee, da, da, very subtle. So the important thing is, I think, to try to feel the music, how more of a natural human way of playing the music would be, rather than trying to do the notes exactly as written. And then I think we can come closer to the stylistic expression of the time. And it's also connected with language, because as you are speaking, as I'm speaking, we are not treating every word and every syllable equally. I would say equally. I would say Jeffrey. I'd say Jeffrey Goodman, right? So we speak in an irregular manner. We emphasize the more important words. I could say, I'm really happy to be with Jeffrey today. So I emphasize Jeffrey, I make it a little bit longer, or I would love to eat pizza tonight. Or I'd love to eat pizza tonight. So we emphasize the important words, we emphasize the important syllables. That's expressive speaking. In Italy, we'll say bella, which means beautiful. We don't say bella, we say bella. That's what influenced the playing. That's one aspect. When the instrumentalists imitated the singers, they played with a rhythmic irregularity that expressed the more important words in the instrumental line, the more important syllables in the instrumental line. So it all comes back to speech. And teachers have been saying for years, for hundreds of years, speak with the music. And if we want to speak with the music, then we really have to see a melodic line or a bass line as a sentence which potentially could have words that could be expressed in various ways.
That's very that's so wonderfully said. I think that the implications of this is that, and I'm not sure to what extent this has taken place or is taking place. I know it's taking place in some areas, but really the teaching of music from day one would really benefit from having teachers who are educated in these traditions and perspectives. As a teacher, and I've been a teacher since I was a teenager, we spend an immense amount of time, for example, chasing after students who forget to observe the dot after a quarter note. and
Yes.
and so the student could possibly say, well, Jeff, that's just my notes inigal today. And somehow there has to be that balance in information. But if you take a full perspective, then I think that a good teaching and good studying will have a balance between all these different things, and with much happier results for everybody, I believe.
I agree with you. And I think that, look, as we both know, teaching for many years, there's no formula, there's no way of deciding what I'm going to do because each student is different. But if we can instill in them the love of words and the love of words connected with music and the way that affects communicating the music, then I think we've done a good job. And of course, they have to develop the technique, the efficiency of movement. That's all extremely important. But with the idea of an image of what we want to communicate. And you can do that with any student of any age. And I'm sure you do. And I try to do that. But I wanted to add one more point. Um, in the realm of what we call irregular playing or inégalité, I think I must mention this concept of tempo rubato, which developed in the 16th and 17th centuries. I'm sorry, in the 16th also, but it was described more in the 17th and 18th centuries. And this is actually quite closely related to irregular playing or inégalité, because the basic idea of tempo rubato as described in Baroque treatises is that you keep the pulse. The big beats stay the same. You have a big pulse. Within the pulse, you play freely. So as long as you get to the next main beat, let's say together with your accompanist, it's fine. But it gives a huge amount of freedom. And it's different from the rubato that developed later, which meant you just play slower or faster. But it means that if you listen to Ella Fitzgerald singing with Joe Pass, you will hear tempo rubato all over the place, because he'll be playing along in with a pulse, and she'll be before the beat, she'll be after the beat, she'll be quicker, she'll be slower, but the beat is there. So I think one of the great arts for playing expressively in a Baroque style is to recognize that we have a pulse very often, but we play freely within the pulse, which is related to inégalité, but it's sort of like a brother-sister relationship. And my recommendation always is listen to the jazz players, because they're doing it every day, all the time.
Mhm.
And if you have an accompanist, the accompanist in Baroque music should keep the pulse, and you go in and out of the beat. And there's even things that are described in the 17th century. For example, Wolfgang Mulius, who went to Italy, as I said, and listened to the singers. It's called anticipazione della nota, anticipazione della silba. It's basically anticipations. So it's exactly what Ella Fitzgerald does. You anticipate the note. And so if you were to write out exactly what you did, your note would be coming a little bit early, or the syllable would be coming early, but the accompaniment is steady, so it works perfectly. And so it gives the impression that you're singing or playing freely, when yet it's only freely between the big beats. Thank you
Yeah,
for listening to
I
that.
think that's very significant, very helpful. Well, Peter, this has been a great introduction and exploration of some of the basic aspects of your book. I have been so pleased to enjoy studying it and exploring it over these past couple years since you published it. I will put in the notes for our interview links for people who wish to connect to it and find it and so forth. So again, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to join us today in this really very wonderful discussion of the plain Baroque music on the classical guitar. It's a big subject, and at least I think we touched upon a few of the points.
Yes, well, thank you very much for having me. And I think, as you can tell, I enjoy talking about this. It's for me, a wonderful subject, because it's all about expressing the music and expressing it in a stylistic way, and communication, which is the primary purpose of music.
Absolutely. So take care. Hopefully more later, and we'll follow up as we can over time. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.